and pickling. Mainly, the only difference between canning and pickling is that pickling is the act of preserving food in vinegar or some kind of acid. So vinegar is created when sugar and water ferment, and that becomes alcohol, and then that alcohol oxidizes. So most, if not all, beers, wines, and ciders will turn into vinegar if left long enough. And it's guessed that the first pickles were made when food was put in wine and beers, and these liquids probably went bad, but the food that was left over ended up actually tasting pretty good. And next we have freezing. So freezing as preservation was a very location specific kind of practice. And anywhere that had the appropriate climate to do so utilized freezing as a way to preserve foods. So cellars, caves, and cold streams were all put to good use for this purpose. From this came the ice house, and eventually that became an ice box that became what we know today as the refrigerator and freezer. Fermentation, if I'm being honest, may possibly be my favorite form of preservation. I just think it's so cool. So fermentation came to be as easily as people began to come together. Opportunistic microorganisms ate natural sugars found in grains, fruits, and vegetables. And in return, in some forms, it gave us beer and wine, but also things like kimchi and sauerkraut. So fermentation really highlights the strength in observation our ancestors had. I think it's just really amazing to kind of see, because it's so just noticing that without like the idea of the scientific process or any of these ways that we have to measure things, they were able to discern what was actually good for us to eat and what they could survive on versus something that had just gone bad and would have made them sick. Fermentation is valuable not only because it preserves food, but it also adds nutrients to food. So the microorganisms that create the cycle can actually produce vitamins as they ferment. And this was also used to make yummier foods from less desirable ingredients. So I don't know how much any of you have heard kind of like the gut brain connection and the idea that there's so much flora in our stomach that actually is really supported by these fermented foods, and it gives them something to help with digestion. It helps with just rebalancing the natural kind of like bacteria that lives in our bodies and makes it so that it's actually something that really, really, really is like quite strengthening for us. And this is what like so many of our ancestors had different versions of for themselves in the ingredients that they had available for them, all kind of aiding in their own health. If you want to go to the next slide, team. And what we're going to be talking about today, drying. So foods have been drying as long as the sun and the wind have been around. But some of the earliest accounts of actual people like deliberately trying to dry plants and meats for food goes back as far as 12,000 BC. And the use of fragrant plants to make ointments as early as 7,000 BC. So what do we mean when we say herb? So herbs are a widely distributed and widespread group of plants, excluding vegetables and other plants consumed for macronutrients. They either have savory or aromatic properties that are used for flavoring and garnishing foods, for medicinal purposes, and for fragrances. And that is on Wikipedia. We could go to the next slide. So for these fragrant plants and many more beyond, obviously, since there's so many vast plants that we can dry for their health, drying them means that their medicinal and aesthetic benefits are able to be incorporated within our everyday life. So some common uses for dried herbs are, of course, culinary, so using it for seasonings, soups, roasts, and stews, medicinal properties, using it for teas, tinctures, packs, and pastes. There's so many accounts of different herbs being chewed up and then kind of like taken back out and being put on animal bites and bug bites in traditional times. And so many of these things were used before any of this was like a written account or quote unquote like peer-reviewed science, so to say. And then we also have body care, so ointments, perfumes, and salves. There are so many ingredients out in the natural world that actually is so good for our skin that's used to either help eczema or sunburns or like, the idea of even aloe on skin whenever you get a sunburn. So they really do kind of help. And last, sacred. So for offerings, for smoke, for protection, or decoration. So if you think of the idea of Christmas and the whole idea of hanging a mistletoe in the doorway, or different herbs having different properties that are meant to bring prosperity or peace, or lavender smell of calm. So a lot of these things are actually used to help in more sacred and like relationship ways between spirit and self. So they're absolutely beautiful ways to use them. Next slide. And for the plants, for many of the plants, a lot of them being herbs, continuous trimming actually allows for energy to go into making new leaves, new blooms, and grow bigger. So this trimming allows for us to extend the lifespan of the plant from seed back to seed. And in this way, it speaks to the relationship between human and plants and how one is because of the direct interaction with another. So this picture I have up here is actually a picture of sweetgrass. And there's a book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, where she talks about the work of studying the sweetgrass and their habits and behaviors over time and trying to restore sweetgrass patches to their natural habitats. And the finding was that the patches that actually had people harvesting them, people interacting with them, were the ones that were growing better, because sweetgrass and the type of plant that is, it actually needs to be harvested for it to be kind of activated into growing more, growing thicker, growing bigger. So a lot of the times when we think of nature, we sometimes feel that it either has to be separate or something that we leave in incredibly pristine kind of measures. But really, it's in those interactions and the ways that we provide what the plant can't for itself. And in doing so, the plant gives us all of these great medicinal food, beautiful smelling things. It really goes to show how it goes hand in hand. And we don't necessarily have to avoid nature to be able to be in good terms with it. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about today 2 different methods of, well, I guess technically 3, but you'll understand a little bit soon. 3 different ways of how to dry your herbs for yourself when you're at home. So drying herbs is incredibly easy, like almost too easy. And it really only requires prep, but the rest of the stuff is up to the left to conditions that you don't control, unless, of course, you're using an oven. So if you're using the sun, a great space that you would want to put this in is in front of a window that gets a lot of light, and specifically in temperatures where it's kind of like it's not incredibly humid. So when you're drying, essentially all we're trying to do is make it so that it's the least favorable place for mold to get into, essentially so that your plants can dry. So if you're using the sun, this is really simple, depending, like, especially with how hot it's been today in the past few days, you could even probably be able to dry your herbs literally just laying outside. But in case you want to do it indoors, it would be great in front of a window, either hanging up or on a sheet. And so different areas like that around the house. You just want to make sure that there's a lot of air circulation so that the leaves are able to dry and not get stuck together for too long. So there are 2 ways to prepare the herbs to dry, which includes either making small bundles that can be hung over, that could be hung and will be left to dry on the plant's full stems, usually in front of windows or in doorways to allow for air circulation. This way is beneficial if you're using it for sacred uses, or if you don't mind crumbly bits if you're going to store them in jars after they dry, and even if you'd like to get into drying flowers. The other method would be to remove the leaves and flowers from the stem so that they can be laid flat on a sheet or a cloth. Similarly, you would leave it in front of that window. Of course, because it's a flat surface, more in front of the window if you have like a tiny sunroom, anything like that. And this would be a lot more common for culinary and medicine making purposes, where really you already know that they're going to get broken into bits. So it doesn't matter too much how it's actually formed. And then the other way, if Of course, we're not all super blessed with like beautiful south-facing windows. And so if natural light is an issue that you have also, you can use the oven. So it'll use the same process as the second method previously mentioned. So again, taking the leaves off of the stem, separating the flowers and laying them flat. On this way, it would either be a cookie rack or a parchment paper on low heat. So less than 150 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 to 4 hours. And this can vary depending on the herb you have, when you harvested it, and how much moisture that's actually left within the leaves. A good way to tell if your leaves or if your herbs are ready and dry is if the leaf crumbles when you touch it. Essentially, you want it to be so dry that it could crack super easily, because then that means it's dehydrated. Next slide, please. So preparation and tips. So first, for harvest, you want to choose stems of your herb that are that are in ideal form. So they're happy looking, they're strong growth from the plant. And next, you want to choose. So depending on what method you're taking, being to either have the leaves that are, you want to choose leaves that are even in color, and you want to remove the bottom stems. So this could actually be a great time while we're talking about this to start preparing for our demo. So I'm just going to move my laptop and you can all tell me if you can still see. I think we have the whole setup ready here. So essentially, when you have your herbs, today I'm going to be using Tulsi basil. A good thing that you want to choose is that you want the leaves to be able to be kind of full, if you can see here, full green, even colored leaves. You want to make sure that they're really kind of in their best, especially. So today's method that we're going to use is that we're going to make bundles out of them. So if you have your herbs, you can start gathering them up and we can start getting ready together for this demo. We can go through the slide and kind of have it all be something that we go through together, just so you can see what I mean when how you want to prepare it. And at this time too, if you have any questions while we're putting anything together, you can totally just ask. Bettina, I can't really see the chat, so if something comes through the chat, you can just say it out loud. But also, if you don't mind, you could even unmute yourselves and talk as well.
So just to clarify, like adwoa, do you want the slide up while you're doing this part?
Yeah. Yes, please.
So if anyone is everyone still able to see your screen clearly? That's what I wanted to confirm.
Yeah, can everyone see my screen clearly? Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Niloufar. Okay.
Thank you.
Oops.
Amazing. So I'll just give everybody a couple of minutes just to get settled, and we can walk through this step by step while also talking about these preparations and tips.
I have a question.
Yes.
When I picked my my basil today, it was kind of wilted because it was hot, and it's not really reviving, but can I dry it anyway?
Yeah, you can dry it anyway. So the whole thing too is like with the dried plants, the best time to actually harvest them is on hot days like this, because again, we're trying to avoid any ways that mold can really start to live and exist. I was kind of worried this morning because it was super like gray and damp and humid and rainy, and I was like, oh my goodness, these plants. But again, because we're going to be drying them, as long as you know that you got them within the same day, a couple of hours ago, it'll be really nice in that sense.
Okay, cool.
All right, sweet. So we can start from the beginning. So harvest. Essentially, with the plants that you want to get, today I'm going to be using holy basil, also known as Tulsi basil, and I'm going to be making a bundle out of it. So today we're going to be talking about how to do it in bundles. But again, at this time, if you don't want to make a bundle and you just want to leave it flat, all you would do is the same process that we're doing in the beginning, but then just taking the leaves off of the main stem. So for the bundling of these herbs, again, you want to choose branches and plants that have good growth. You want to choose them closer to the top and some of the older growth. You don't really want to go into the baby leaves just because you want to give them time to actually mature and be how you want them to be. This is a really nice way because you can get the really beautiful smells from the herbs when you cut them fresh this way. Another thing you want to do is when you choose your branches, you want to make sure you avoid ones that may have different kind of, just for the purpose of drying, like these ones that kind of have holes in them, that have a bunch of markings, depending on the plants that you have. Depending on the plants that you have, they may even have to deal with, you want to make sure that they don't have any pests. Ones that have holes you want to avoid. So at this time, you would sort through the branches that you have, choosing the branches and choosing the leaves that look the most like well-formed, that really don't have any marks or holes, that are all the even color, and also kind of, yeah, like take this leaf, for example, like these, this is not a leaf you want to put in your drying bundle. So as you're going through them, some of the parts kind of come through together. So for cleaning your herbs, before you start getting them ready for actually being prepared to dry, you want to actually clean them. So depending on how you may have learned it or how you've already done it, you actually don't necessarily want to run herbs underwater. So what you can do instead is I have with me a paper towel and just a little bowl of water that I use to gently wipe the leaves of the plant. And this ensures that you don't actually have to add too much extra moisture that may get stuck in the crevices and grooves of the branches, but you can still wipe off all the leaves, just of any dust, any soil, any kind of pests or bugs. These are going to be the parts that poses the biggest barriers or the biggest challenges in creating mold, just because as things actually go bad, they'll be stuck to the leaf. So as you do that, you want to go through the branches, making sure that you're kind of measuring it together and seeing, making sure that you leave enough space. Did you have a question? So if you can see.
Eliana, I just muted you, so feel free to unmute if you have anything to add. And I think we just have someone new as well, Adwoa, that came in.
Amazing. Hello, thank you for joining us. We're just getting into the demo part of our herb bundling process. There are a couple of ways to actually dry your herbs depending on how you want to do it. And today I'll be walking us through making just like a really simple bundle. These are really great if you don't mind. Actually, these are really great for fragrant herbs if you want to leave them somewhere. Yeah, and if you can't see anything that I'm doing in the demo, let me know and I can like re-angle and figure it out as well as possible. So I have with me today some Tulsi holy basil that we're going to be preparing to be dried. I'm just going through the branches and taking off any of the bottom leaves and making it so I have an even place that I can tie the herbs at. And this will be what I'm going to use so that I can hang them off of anything, either in between doorways or over a window so that it can dry for later use. So as I was saying, you want to take your paper towel if you're cleaning your herbs and essentially dip it in water and just wipe the leaves. Beyond the idea of also making sure that there's no mold, you also just want to take care of your plants and be as gentle as possible, especially because these are going to be dried. Any kind of extra stress they may go under or anything else may just be pockets of bacteria and mold that will be able to grow that you don't necessarily want. And so every so often I take my branches together and make sure there's still an even place for me to be able to tie them when the time comes. So you can see I'm leaving about just like a thumb's bit of space, but you definitely can leave a little bit more or less. Ooh. Can everyone still see me? Okay, perfect. the screen went out for a second. So here we go. And at this time too, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to unmute yourself, type it in the chat while we're going along. So really the size of your bundle is just your own preference. This can be a good enough size, but I'm gonna be adding a little bit more just because I took off quite a bit from my plant since it was pretty big.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hey, how you doing? My
No,
question
sorry,
is,
my camera
what would
for
you
a
say the
second.
difference of like not cleaning the herbs with water versus like, yeah, not doing that?
Sorry, I have to leave the class, but I will watch the video. My grandson got stung by a bee, and I have
Oh,
to take care
no.
of him. So, but I will watch the rest when you post the video. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry. I hope your grandson's
Sorry.
okay. Bye.
Bye.
Sorry, Chanel, you can go. Let me know if I said your name right also.
Yes, you did say it correctly. How do I say your name?
Adwoa.
Adwoa. Okay, nice to meet you. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, feeling nice. It's really hot outside.
I know. It's super hot
Is it
outside.
hot? Is it hotter up because you're in Canada, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you in Canada?
No,
Where are you
I'm
from?
in Jersey. In Jersey.
Wow, thank you for joining us. Oh my goodness. That's so
Yeah.
cool.
My friend from farm school told me about it.
That's amazing. Tell that friend major thanks for suggesting us.
He was telling me about the mushrooms. See, I have mushroom
my
classes.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
So what
But
was
my
your
question
question,
is,
sorry? Yes.
sorry, is about the difference of not washing them and washing them, because you
Mhm.
know it's like washing them and just talking about like it could get moldy, and also using a paper towel. So what's the difference if I just like, you know how you can just like dust it off versus like
Yeah,
doing any extra work to it? So what would you say is the
totally.
difference
The
of
main
doing of the two
difference,
process?
yeah, totally. The main difference would be that depending on where you're growing to, like if you're growing, like especially if you're growing in pots inside of homes, if you're growing on planters in your balcony, if it's like a super homey operation, you don't necessarily have to wash the herbs or wash the leaves intensely because you already know that they're not really interacting with too much with any outside factors. Like these are for herbs specifically if you're growing them outside, even in community pots. You just want to make sure that there's not like any pests, any little bugs there, a lot of dirt or dust, because those, if they start to like break down, essentially that'll be what causes the mold in between the leaves. So even if you go through all the leaves and it looks like it's pretty much okay, you don't necessarily have to wipe the leaves down, especially if it's like a home operation as well.
Would that be the same also for wild herbs, like picking the ones that already grow naturally versus the one you're actually growing?
For those ones, I would suggest washing them just because since they're already growing out in the wild, and especially because like depending on where you're picking them up too, like if you're in like closer to city or residential areas, you just want to make sure just in case anything that's already in the air, you just want to get that off for yourself. Especially, and it depends too, right? Like if you're using these herbs for eating purposes, then yes, wash them. But if you're using them for fragrance, if you're using them for different purposes, maybe art, salad making, something that'll go through a process where you won't eat it, then again, the washing is kind of like you don't necessarily have to do it because then it won't go into your body. But if you're making teas with it, if you're using it for cooking or anything, I would suggest washing it if you find it outside for sure.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate you.
thank you. So let's see here. So we can talk about some tips that you want to have before you're cutting your herbs, just to make sure you can have a good bundle. As I'm talking, I'm going to be putting this together now. You can see it's a pretty nice sized bundle I got going on here. I'm choosing to keep the flowers on because eventually I'm probably going to use this as tea. And You can drink the like you can make tea with the flowers of holy basil as well. So I don't actually have to do too much except creating a little end that I can tie everything with. So some things you want to remember when you're actually getting your herbs is that you want to give thanks for your plants. This is a big relationship, right? You want to hum songs to them as you harvest. You can remember that the plants have been by our sides right from the beginning, providing medicine and food and doing all these things before we really even understood what they were. So you want to try to harvest at the most 1/3 of the plant to allow it to continue to photosynthesize. And this is especially important if you have like bigger plants that can keep growing through the season. So for the basil, for example, I've been just cutting off the flowers every couple of weeks, but now it's kind of like getting in the way of the peppers. So I took like a good amount, right? So now that I've left this, there's still a shrub of it that's left that'll be able to make new leaves, make new blooms, and I'll probably be able to get at least like 4 or 5 different cuts out of it before I actually have to before the growing season ends. Now, if you were doing this at the end of the season, you would be able just to cut the whole plant and do the process of using it for whatever you want, whether you're using them fresh or dry. But this is necessary, but you would want to do this only if you were ready for the plant to be done. But if you wanted to continue to keep growing, you only want to take at most 1/3 and off of the top half of the plant as well. So leaving the bottom ones to grow and mature a little bit more. So herbs also start to lose their beneficial volatile oils. So the ones that we're looking to preserve, these are the oils that are giving the herbs its smell. These are the herbs that are giving these are the oils that are giving the herbs all their medicinal properties, all their things. So we want to keep it that once you know, like right when they're harvested, that you know what you're doing with them. So you can get away with leaving it like if you harvest them in the morning, leaving in them until the evening. But ideally, these ones, like these branches that I cut, I did like 10 minutes before the workshop started, just to make sure that they weren't laying around too long before we started kind of getting into them. And mold is the biggest challenge in herb drying. Most of the process is trying to limit the amount of excess moisture so that the plant can dry quicker before it can decompose. So again, similarly, that whole idea of the only thing that makes drying herbs hard is that you can run into the place of mold really quickly. It depends a lot on where you're storing the herbs. So depending on if you have a lot of humidity in your house, I would suggest even leaving it somewhere where you can put it by an open window, just so we can catch a bit of a breeze, right? You can probably even get away with I would say more than light, it's like a combination of light and wind. So being able to have these in a place where they actually get some light and are able to dry and hang loosely, but also getting wind to be able to go through in between the leaves so that everything can actually be dried and stable. And at that point, they're pretty much good for, I would say, 2 years, especially depending on how you store them after, if you leave them in jars, if you use them in different products, or even if you're using them as like a decorational piece. I have like a bundle of mint in my room from 3 years ago, and it's still great. It definitely has lost its smell, but it's like pretty to look at. So another tip is to try to avoid harvesting plants on rainy days. Mold becomes easier when the plant is already damp. So I just want to check in and see how everyone's doing with your bundles and if you're ready to move on to the tying part. And alternatively, if you're not making a bundle and you're using the kind of sheet method to dry them, all you would do is, I'll take this as an example. So this is a branch that I won't really be using because a lot of the leaves have like holes and stuff in them. So all you would want to do then is take the leaf this way with just its tiny branch. And this way, it's able to, so I'm just going to take a few to show you. And similarly, you can do it. Some plants, depending, you may not be able to use the flowers, but for most of them you are. So if you were leaving them on a sheet to dry without any use of the bundle, all you would do is leaving them on a single layer, putting them and spacing them out. And this way you would be able to leave it in front of your windows, on your cupboard, however you want to do it, and it would be able to dry that way. I would suggest you place it somewhere that has a lot of light, just so you don't get into the idea of, like, again, dark, damp spaces are like beautiful places for mold to grow that we don't want. And again, if you're in like a really hot place right now, you could leave these out in the morning, and by the nighttime, they'll probably be dried already. So you want to remember that single layer, giving everything space and room to breathe, and just laying it wherever you want to begin the drying process. And now, if you're doing the bundle with us, you can take your string and you can just cut a bit. Depending on how you want to hang it, that's how long probably it would take for. So no, you don't have to use any special type of string. Like literally any string is okay for it. But depending on what you use it for, the only thing I would say is, like, if you're using them to burn in like incense ways, using a string that just isn't like coated with like intense paints or something. But like most string isn't, so you'll be okay that way. So I'm just gonna cut a piece of string. I have this. I'm gonna be doubling it up just so it's a little bit more sturdy. No worries, Jessica. Thanks for joining us. Just because the string is a little bit more thinner. So I have like a pretty good amount here. And then I'm gonna take my bundle, and I already have it. And as I was sorting through the leaves, I kind of created that little, just a little bit of space, a little handle, quote unquote, for it to be able to be held that way, while just kind of arranging it in a way where it just lets it fall down. So with these bundles, they'll be hanging upside down as they dry. And this just gives them room, you know, letting them free form. You may start to hear them crumble if you have them somewhere, but that just means it's closer to drying. So I'm gonna take my string, and then I'm gonna start wrapping it around. Again, depending on how much space you've given yourself, you don't actually necessarily need too much branch space. And whatever leaves that kind of didn't make it because of this, you can use for fresh teas, you can use in food, you can use it so that they don't necessarily have to go bad. And so
Good.
wrapping this around, making a little bit of, giving it a little bit of space, making it a little bit thick just so it's sturdy. And depending on the space in your home, you can just like hang it off of like a nail. You can hang it off of a windowsill if you have those like racks that let you hang stuff off of it. I have like a little shelf I'm gonna hang it off of. And you want to make sure that the handle is sturdy and tight, especially for these ones that are going to be left loose on the ends here. You just want to make sure that this part is okay, because as the leaves dry, they'll actually grow smaller and dehydrate. So you want to do it as tight as possible, just so the string doesn't become loose.
I think I missed the part about the handle. How do you do that? I don't know if you can see me.
I can see yours. You have enough. Honestly, like the handle isn't anything intense. It's just taking off a few of the bottom leaves so that there's an even amount of space for you to tie the string around.
Oh,
But
I
some
see.
of the branches, you don't even necessarily need to do that, depending
Okay.
on like how the branches are themselves.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna
Thanks.
try this, no worries. Just gonna tie this a couple of times. And then tie it again. Okay. And here we have it. We now have a little handle. That looks so nice, Barb. Very good. Yeah. And so now I'm just gonna give this a little handle. And from this place, I could hang it off of anything. And you can leave this on your window, wherever you're hanging it to dry. And it should be dried within a couple of weeks, depending, and anywhere from a few days to a couple of weeks. It really just depends on the conditions of your house. My house is kind of humid, so I'm thinking it's gonna take a little bit more time. But similarly, it should take no more than like 3 weeks max. That looks so nice, Barb. You did great. Yeah. So here are our herb bundles. If anybody else joined in and you want to kind of show yours, you totally can, but no pressure. This is a great time for any questions if anybody has them. It is 4:51, so we have a few more minutes left. So telltale signs that it's done drying is that the leaf will literally crunch when you hold it. So if you you can check on it every single day. The leaves will start to get softer and softer, and then they'll start to get like more and more firm. Like imagine the way herbs look when you like buy them at the store. So you'll know that they're dry just by feeling a leaf, and it'll like crumble in your hands, and you'll know you'll be good. And if you also want to test, any of these branches will begin to snap really easily when it's dry, especially if you want to tell if like the stem itself is dry versus if just the leaves are dry, since the leaves may dry a little bit quicker. So again, you just want to break off a little piece. If it snaps super easily, it's dry. But if it's still kind of like, if there's some tension or if it kind of is like soft, you want to leave it hanging a little bit longer. Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Did you see the one about oregano? See my oregano?
Yes. Wait, the question
So-
about oregano? Let me
Yeah.
see.
So Barb asks, what about oregano on a sheet? Do you just leave the leaves on the stem?
Yes. Like
Okay.
herbs like oregano, thyme, I would even argue rosemary. Those ones you can just like leave on a sheet with their branches, just because the leaves are so tiny that by the time they dry anyway, it'll like they'll separate themselves easily, so you won't have to worry. Yeah, so those
Okay.
ones can just go straight on a sheet and they'll dry
Okay.
that way. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes. So for tinctures, you would use the stems, totally. So
Oh.
especially depending on which plants that you're using, some of them, the stems themselves also hold medicinal properties. So you can totally add it in for tinctures, for salves even. So like for things where you're going to be like straining or draining, the stems are great in that. Really the only times you don't want the stems is if you're going to be using them for like food, so to say, and there's like a huge branch, like like these branches wouldn't be necessarily the easiest in stews, right? So like for these ones you would want to take them off. But for like this for a tincture, I would definitely leave them on the stem and add them to the concoction and like the recipe that you're making. Very good question. Sea moss is super cool. Yes. I've only personally made tinctures using alcohol, so that's the one I'm most versed with. But I think sea moss would be a great medium for it in that way. And like again, sea moss holds its own benefits, so that could be a very cool mixture. Wondering, can you all hear me properly? Yes. Okay. Cool. Zoom keeps telling me stuff, so I don't know what's up.
Oh, I hate that.
Thanks, y'all. Okay, we have a few more minutes left. Any time for some questions? Even all of you could tell me what your favorite herbs are. And it can be questions about anything, like anything I talked about earlier in the presentation, or anything that you may just be wondering about herbs as well.
I'm curious
Yes.
about, you mentioned fermentation and sauerkraut and vinegar. My neighbor is Croatian and she makes her own sauerkraut, has her whole life, and all she uses is salt.
Yeah.
So how does that make vinegar? Or does it?
It doesn't necessarily make vinegar, but the really cool thing is that a lot of these ingredients for fermentation actually exist by itself. Yes, so the salt interacts with the sauerkraut in that it releases a bunch of water from the cabbage, but then it's actually natural wild yeast found on the cabbage itself that starts to ferment it. So literally all you have to add is salt and it'll start doing the thing by itself. So it's a really cool, and that's the really nice thing about most fermentations, like even with like fruit ones, for example, grapes, like wine, like when I was doing research for this presentation, they were talking about how the first beer was very much probably like it had rained over a bucket of barley, you know, like a lot of these ingredients actually either turn into natural sugars or have natural wild yeasts on it that allow for fermentation to start just by water being added, just by sugar being added, or just by salt being added. So it really is like, it's a really simple process and it can seem daunting, but like fermenting is so easy and so like almost like once you get a hang of it, you're like, I can do this to everything. Amazing. All right.
Have you ever fermented an herb?
So I haven't fermented an herb, but I usually add like a stick of rosemary or a stick of something into anything I am fermenting
Oh, I see.
for
Okay.
like deliciousness.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know
Thanks.
what? We can look into a workshop on fermenting for sure. I think that could be really cool for later in the fall time. So thanks for that and keep an eye out.
Have you pickled mushroom, or is also in the drying process is similar for mushrooms as well?
Pardon?
For mushrooms, have you ever pickled mushrooms?
Ooh, I haven't pickled mushrooms yet, but I think that would be, I've had them before. Pickle, like food kind of, it's pickled food and fermented food used to really make me nervous, but I have tried a pickled mushroom and it's not bad, but I haven't ventured into that myself. I've pickled like garlic scapes. I've pickled like made regular pickles. I've made pickled beets and like weird stuff, just random stuff, but I haven't ventured into that yet. And yes, yeah, definitely our urban harvest team is very, very cool and very hands-on with all things preservation in general. So we should definitely try to get them involved in maybe like a fall preservation fermentation series. So again, we will connect. And thank you. Yeah, this was great. Thanks, y'all. With that, thank you so much for everything. This is recorded, so the replay will be sending out a link probably tomorrow at some point with the YouTube link for it. So you can have this access for this if you ever decide you do want to dry your herbs. And yeah, thank you so much. It was a really nice and intimate and small workshop, and this has been really cool. I hope everybody enjoys their evening. Bye.
Thank you.
And if you end up trying your herbs, you should send us a picture.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you for joining all the way from Jersey. Amazing.
Yeah. You already know.
Bye. Thank you.
Me too.
Wow.
Peace.
I'm
Bye.
looking at the recording.